Hey guys, tonight we begin with the surprisingly complex and occasionally brutal reality of Roman gladiators. What did these legendary fighters actually do all day? Turns out, it wasn't just endless arena battles and dramatic death scenes like Hollywood wants you to believe. We're diving into the daily grind of ancient Rome's most famous entertainers, from dawn training sessions that would make modern athletes weep to the surprisingly mundane reality of life between the legendary fights. You'll discover that being a gladiator was less about glorious combat and more about surviving a lifestyle that was part military boot camp, part celebrity culture, and entirely unlike anything you've seen in the movies. Ready to find out what really filled the hours between those moments of arena fame? Let's step into the world of Rome's ultimate performers. But before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Now grab your favorite drink, turn down those lights, and let's journey back to ancient Rome together. Picture this. You're waking up in what's basically ancient Rome's version of a maximum security prison crossed with a very expensive gym. Welcome to the Ludus, the gladiator school where Rome's most famous fighters lived, trained, and tried not to die between arena appearances. The wake-up call came just after dawn, and it wasn't your phone alarm or a gentle knock on the door. It was a trainer banging on metal, shouting orders, and making it very clear that sleeping in wasn't an option. Roman gladiators didn't get to hit the snooze button, partly because snooze buttons didn't exist, but mostly because their trainers would have beaten them with sticks if they tried. The Ludus itself was about as welcoming as you'd expect from a place designed to house people whose job was killing each other for entertainment. Stone walls, cold floors, and the permanent stink of sweat, oil, and whatever passes for deodorant when you're living in the ancient world with a bunch of muscular guys who spend their days beating each other up. Your sleeping arrangements depended entirely on how good you were at not dying in the arena. New gladiators, the ones who hadn't proven they could survive more than one fight, slept in cells that were basically stone boxes with barely enough room to lie down. These cells were about as comfortable as they sound, which is to say, not at all. If you were lucky enough to be a veteran gladiator who'd survived multiple fights and gained some reputation, you might get upgraded to dormitory-style housing. This meant sharing a larger room with other successful fighters, which was marginally better than sleeping in a cell, but still involved sharing your living space with people who were trained to kill and had probably seen too many of their friends die in the arena. The really successful gladiators, the ones who'd become genuine celebrities, might get private rooms with actual amenities. But even these upgrades were still inside the Ludus, still surrounded by stone walls and armed guards, still making it clear that no matter how famous you became, you were still property. The morning routine was military precise, because gladiator schools were run by people who understood that discipline was the difference between profitable entertainers and dead investments. Everyone woke up at the same time, everyone got dressed at the same time, and everyone started their day with the same understanding. This might be the last morning you ever see. The floors were cold stone that had been polished smooth by thousands of feet over the years. In winter, getting out of bed meant stepping onto surfaces that felt like they'd been designed specifically to make you miserable. In summer, the stone was slightly less freezing, but the rooms were stuffy and hot, filled with the breathing and body heat of men who lived under constant stress. The smell was something you either got used to or went crazy from. Imagine a gym that's never been properly cleaned, mixed with the scent of olive oil, leather, metal, and the kind of body odor that comes from people who exercise intensely every day and don't have access to modern hygiene products. Add in the smell of fear, because let's be honest, these were people who knew they might die for entertainment, and you get an aromatic experience that would make modern people immediately head for the exit. The trainers who ran the morning wake-up calls were usually retired gladiators who'd survived long enough to earn their freedom, or at least their authority. These guys had seen it all, done it all, and survived it all, which made them both valuable teachers and absolutely terrifying supervisors. They knew every trick for avoiding work, every excuse for poor performance, and every way that gladiators might try to get out of their obligations. The morning light that filtered through the small windows or openings in the ludus walls was often the only natural light gladiators would see for hours. The rest of their day would be spent in training areas, baths, or other indoor spaces where they could be supervised and controlled. For many gladiators, those few minutes of morning sunlight were a daily reminder of the world outside the walls that they might never see again. The social dynamics of waking up in a ludus were complex and dangerous. You were surrounded by men who were your training partners, your competitors, and potentially your executioners. Some of these men would become your closest friends, bonded by shared danger and mutual survival. Others would kill you in the arena if given the chance, and they'd do it in front of thousands of cheering spectators. The psychological pressure of starting each day with this reality was something that most gladiators never fully adjusted to. You woke up knowing that your life was entirely in the hands of other people, that your survival depended on entertaining crowds who saw you as disposable, and that every friendship you formed might end with one of you dying while the other one lived. The ranking system that determined your sleeping arrangements also determined your morning routine. Higher-ranked gladiators got better treatment, more privileges, and slightly more control over their daily schedules. Lower-ranked gladiators got orders, strict supervision, and the constant reminder that they were one bad performance away from being fed to wild animals. The physical discomfort of waking up in a ludus was just the beginning of days that would be filled with pain, exhaustion, and the constant threat of injury or death. But for many gladiators, the psychological discomfort was worse. You were waking up to another day of being valuable property in a system that treated human lives as entertainment investments. The morning routine was designed to break down individual identity and rebuild it around the role of gladiator. You weren't Marcus or Gaius or whatever your name had been before you ended up in the ludus. You were a Mamillo, a Thraex, a Retiarius, or whatever fighting style you'd been assigned based on your physical characteristics and training aptitude. The trainers who supervised the morning wake-up calls were also evaluating their investments. They were looking for signs of injury, illness, depression, or rebellion that might affect a gladiator's performance. A fighter who looked sick might be sent to the medical staff. A fighter who looked rebellious might be sent to punishment. A fighter who looked ready to give up might be sent to fights that were designed to be his last. For gladiators, morning in the ludus was the daily reminder that they were living on borrowed time in a system that valued them only for their ability to entertain crowds through violence. Every sunrise was another day of survival, another chance to prove their worth, and another step closer to either freedom or death. The stone walls that surrounded them weren't just physical barriers. They were psychological ones that separated gladiators from the world of free Roman citizens. Inside those walls, different rules applied, different values mattered, and different fates awaited people who were seen as entertainment rather than human beings. But morning in the ludus was also the start of another day of life. Another opportunity to train and improve, another chance to form bonds with fellow fighters, and another day to hope that somehow, some way, they might survive long enough to see freedom again. The wake-up call that started each day in the ludus was the sound of a system that had turned human combat into profitable entertainment, but it was also the sound of men who refused to give up hope, even when hope seemed impossible. After dragging themselves out of bed in the ludus, gladiators faced a morning routine that would make modern gym-goers feel right at home. If modern gym-goers were also valuable property whose bodies were worth more than most Roman citizens' annual salaries, welcome to gladiator hygiene and maintenance, where personal care wasn't about feeling fresh and confident, but about protecting investments that could buy and sell small villages. The first order of business was shaving, and we're not talking about a quick buzz with an electric razor while checking your phone. Roman gladiators had to maintain their appearance with bronze razors that were about as sharp as a butter knife and roughly as safe to use. The process was time-consuming, painful, and absolutely mandatory, because nothing said professional fighter quite like a face that looked like it had been attacked by an angry cat. Gladiators shaved their faces, their heads, and pretty much every other part of their bodies that might give an opponent something to grab during combat. Body hair was seen as a tactical disadvantage, like wearing a handle that your enemy could use to throw you around the arena. The shaving process was usually done by other gladiators or slaves, because trying to shave your own back with a bronze razor was a good way to accidentally commit suicide before you even made it to the arena. The oil came next, and this wasn't some fancy moisturizer you'd buy at a high-end spa. This was practical, functional oil that served multiple purposes. It protected the skin from cuts and scrapes during training. It made gladiators harder to grab during combat, and it gave them that glossy, muscular look that made crowds go wild. Think of it as the ancient world's version of professional wrestling, but with higher stakes and no predetermined outcomes. Gladiators went through olive oil like modern athletes go through protein powder. They rubbed it on their skin, worked it into their muscles, and applied it so thoroughly that they basically became human slip and slides. The oil also served as a primitive form of sunscreen, which was important when you spent most of your day training outdoors in the Mediterranean sun. The daily gear maintenance was like a religious ritual, because your equipment was literally what kept you alive. Gladiators cleaned, oiled, and inspected every piece of their gear with the kind of attention to detail that modern mechanics give to Formula One race cars. A loose strap on your helmet, a crack in your shield, or a dull edge on your sword could mean the difference between walking out of the arena and being carried out on a stretcher. Weapons had to be cleaned of blood, sweat, and oil from the previous day's training. Leather armor needed to be treated to prevent cracking and maintain flexibility. Metal pieces had to be polished to prevent rust and ensure they moved smoothly. This wasn't just about looking good. It was about making sure your equipment would work perfectly when your life depended on it. The public baths were a crucial part of the gladiator routine, but they weren't just about getting clean. These were ancient Rome's version of modern sports medicine facilities, complete with hot pools, cold pools, and massage areas designed specifically for muscle recovery. Gladiators understood the importance of proper recovery long before modern athletes figured out ice baths and compression therapy. The bath routine was sophisticated and systematic. First, you'd hit the caldarium, the hot room, where you'd sweat out the toxins and relax your muscles. Then you'd move to the tepidarium, the warm room, for gradual temperature adjustment. Finally, you'd shock your system in the frigidarium, the cold room, to reduce inflammation and speed recovery. It was like an ancient Roman CrossFit recovery protocol, but with more marble and fewer Instagram posts. The massage component wasn't about relaxation. It was about maintenance. Gladiators received deep tissue work from skilled attendants who knew exactly how to work out the knots, bruises, and tension that came from daily combat training. These massages were often painful, but they were essential for keeping fighters in peak physical condition. The bathing process also included scraping off the oil and dirt with a curved metal tool called a strigil. This was ancient Rome's version of exfoliation, and it was about as comfortable as it sounds. The strigil removed dead skin, excess oil, and the accumulated grime from training. leaving gladiators with skin that was clean, but probably resembled a lobster that had been thoroughly scrubbed. Body maintenance for gladiators was serious business because their bodies were serious investments. A gladiator who got sick, injured, or infected was a gladiator who couldn't fight, and a gladiator who couldn't fight was worthless to the people who owned them. The owners of gladiator schools understood that proper hygiene and maintenance were essential for protecting their assets. Infections were particularly dangerous because they could spread quickly through the close quarters of the ludus. A small cut that got infected could put a valuable fighter out of commission for weeks, or worse, kill them before they ever made it to the arena. The daily hygiene routine was designed to prevent these kinds of problems before they started. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that gladiators, who were slaves and considered property, often received better health care and hygiene than free Roman citizens. They had access to the best medical care, the finest oils and treatments, and facilities that rivaled those available to the wealthy elite. But all of this care came with the understanding that they were being maintained like prize racehorses, valuable only for their ability to perform. The psychological aspect of the daily hygiene routine was complex. On one hand, it was a reminder of their status as property. They were being groomed and maintained like valuable objects. On the other hand, it was one of the few times during the day when they could focus on themselves, take care of their bodies, and experience something that resembled normal human self-care. The communal nature of the baths and grooming created opportunities for social bonding among gladiators. These were times when they could talk, share information, and form the relationships that would help them survive the brutal realities of their existence. The baths were where friendships were formed, alliances were made, and survival strategies were shared. For many gladiators, the daily hygiene routine was also a form of meditation, a time to mentally prepare for the day ahead, to process the trauma of their situation, and to find some small measure of peace in the chaos of their lives. The ritual of caring for their bodies and equipment was a way of asserting some control over their circumstances, even when they had very little control over their actual fate. The maintenance of their bodies and equipment was ultimately about survival in a system that saw them as disposable entertainment. Every morning, gladiators had to wake up and prepare themselves for another day of training that might injure them, another day of living as property, and another day of moving closer to their next arena appearance. But the hygiene routine was also about dignity. Even in a system that dehumanized them, gladiators found ways to take care of themselves, to maintain their health and appearance, and to preserve some sense of personal worth. The daily ritual of cleaning, oiling, and maintaining their gear was a small act of rebellion against a system that treated them as objects rather than people. If you thought modern fitness influencers were obsessed with their diets, you haven't met a Roman gladiator. These ancient warriors followed eating plans that were so specific, so carefully calculated, and so utterly bizarre by today's standards that they'd make your keto-obsessed gym buddy look like a casual snacker. Welcome to gladiator nutrition, where carb loading was an art form, and protein shakes were made of things you definitely don't want to know about. The gladiator diet was revolutionary for its time, though it would horrify modern nutritionists. While wealthy Romans were feasting on exotic meats, fine wines, and elaborate delicacies, gladiators were eating what amounted to ancient Rome's version of a vegan bodybuilder's meal plan. They were nicknamed hordeari, literally barley men, because their diet was built around grains, legumes, and vegetables rather than the meat-heavy meals you'd expect from professional fighters. Breakfast in the ludus started with barley porridge, which was basically ancient Rome's answer to oatmeal, but with less flavor and more practical purpose. This wasn't the kind of breakfast you'd Instagram. It was thick, filling, and designed to provide sustained energy for hours of brutal training. The porridge was often mixed with beans, which added protein and made the meal even more filling, though it probably didn't do wonders for the air quality in the dormitories. The barley wasn't just randomly chosen as a gladiator staple. It was packed with carbohydrates for energy, fiber for digestion, and complex nutrients that provided sustained fuel for intense physical activity. Modern endurance athletes would recognize the wisdom of this approach, even if they'd probably prefer their carbs in the form of energy bars rather than thick, greyish porridge. Beans were a crucial part of the gladiator breakfast, and we're talking about serious quantities of legumes. Lentils, chickpeas, and broad beans were staples that provided protein, fiber, and the kind of sustained energy that could power a gladiator through hours of combat training. The beans were often cooked with the barley to create a one-pot meal that was efficient to prepare and distribute to hundreds of fighters. Here's where gladiator nutrition gets really weird. By modern standards, they consumed ash. Not just any ash, but specifically ash from burned bones and plants that was high in calcium. This was their supplement routine, their ancient version of calcium tablets, designed to strengthen their bones and help them recover from the constant physical trauma of training and fighting. Imagine explaining to a modern nutritionist that your pre-workout routine includes eating ash, and you'll understand why gladiator dietary habits were so unique. The ash wasn't just sprinkled on top of food like some kind of ancient seasoning. It was mixed into their drinks, stirred into their porridge, and consumed in quantities that would make modern health officials very nervous. But the gladiators' calcium needs were extreme. They were constantly breaking bones, fracturing ribs, and dealing with injuries that required serious bone recovery. The ash was their way of providing the minerals their bodies needed to heal and strengthen. What gladiators didn't eat was almost as important as what they did eat. Meat was severely limited, which seems counterintuitive for professional fighters who needed to build and maintain serious muscle mass. But gladiator trainers understood something that modern sports science has rediscovered. Bulk and endurance were more important than lean muscle for arena combat. They needed fighters who could absorb punishment, maintain energy throughout long battles, and recover quickly from injuries. The limited meat in their diet came mostly from cheaper cuts and organ meats, rather than the premium steaks and roasts that wealthy Romans enjoyed. When gladiators did get meat, it was often used as a reward for good performance or as a special treat before important fights. The meat was usually cooked in simple stews or broths that could be easily distributed and digested. Alcohol was strictly controlled in the ludus, which must have been a serious disappointment for men who were facing potential death on a regular basis. While free Romans could drink wine throughout the day, gladiators were limited to small amounts, usually diluted with water and only with meals. The trainers understood that alcohol affected reaction times, decision-making, and physical coordination, all things that could get a gladiator killed in the arena. Instead of wine, gladiators drank posca, which was basically ancient Rome's version of a sports drink. Posca was made from water, vinegar, and sometimes herbs, creating a tart, refreshing beverage that helped with hydration and provided some nutrients. It was cheap to produce, easy to store, and actually effective at preventing scurvy and other nutritional deficiencies that could affect performance. The posca wasn't just about nutrition. It was about practicality. In a world without refrigeration, the vinegar in posca helped kill bacteria and made water safer to drink. For gladiators who were constantly sweating and needed to stay hydrated, posca provided a reliable source of fluids that wouldn't make them sick or impair their performance. The portion sizes for gladiator meals were massive by modern standards. These men were burning thousands of calories per day through intense training, and they needed to consume enough food to fuel their activities and maintain their body weight. The breakfast alone probably contained more calories than many modern people eat in an entire day, but gladiators needed every calorie to survive their training regimen. The meal timing was also strategic. Breakfast was substantial because it had to provide energy for the morning training session, but it was also designed to be easily digestible so that gladiators wouldn't get sick or sluggish during physical activity. The high carbohydrate content provided quick energy, while the protein from beans helped with muscle recovery and growth. The communal nature of gladiator meals served multiple purposes beyond nutrition. Eating together reinforced the social bonds between fighters, created opportunities for sharing information and strategies, and allowed trainers to monitor their fighters' health and appetite. A gladiator who wasn't eating well might be sick, injured, or psychologically struggling, all things that could affect performance. The monotony of the gladiator diet was intentional. The same foods, prepared the same way, day after day, eliminated variables that could affect performance. There were no surprises, no digestive issues from unfamiliar foods, and no opportunity for gladiators to make poor nutritional choices that could compromise their training. The psychological impact of the gladiator diet was significant. The repetitive, limited menu was another reminder that these men were property rather than free citizens. They couldn't choose what to eat, when to eat, or how much to consume. Every meal was determined by their trainers, based on what would make them better fighters, not what would make them happy or satisfied. But the diet also represented a form of care and investment. Gladiator owners spent considerable money on feeding their fighters, and the nutritional program was based on real understanding of what the human body needed to perform at peak levels. In many ways, gladiators ate better than most free Romans, even if their food choices were severely limited. The breakfast routine in the ludus was a daily reminder of the gladiators' unusual position in Roman society. They were slaves who received better nutrition than many free citizens, fighters who were fed vegetarian diets, and valuable property who were cared for like prize livestock. Every morning, as they consumed their barley porridge, beans, and ash-laced posca, they were participating in a nutritional program that was both scientifically advanced and profoundly dehumanizing. The gladiator diet was ultimately about creating fighters who could survive, perform, and entertain. It was a system that prioritized function over pleasure, endurance over taste, and performance over personal choice. But for the men who lived on this diet, it was also fuel for survival, sustenance for another day of training, and nourishment for bodies that were constantly pushed to their limits in service of Roman entertainment. After choking down their breakfast of barley porridge and ash supplements, gladiators faced the part of their day that would make modern CrossFit enthusiasts weep with terror and beg for mercy. Welcome to gladiator physical conditioning, where the concept of rest day didn't exist, where light workout meant you might only vomit once, and where the training equipment was designed by people who apparently believed that if it wasn't potentially lethal, it wasn't worth using. The physical conditioning program for gladiators was so intense, so comprehensive, and so utterly brutal that it would make Navy SEAL training look like a relaxing yoga retreat. These weren't casual gym sessions where you could check your phone between sets or take a water break whenever you felt like it. This was systematic, scientific torture designed to transform human bodies into weapons that could survive the arena and entertain bloodthirsty crowds. The training day started with weightlifting, but forget everything you know about modern gym equipment. Gladiators lifted stones, lead weights, and iron implements that were heavy enough to build serious muscle and awkward enough to develop functional strength. We're talking about rocks that weighed as much as small cars, metal bars that could double as weapons, and training implements that were designed to be difficult to handle rather than ergonomically friendly. The stone lifting wasn't just about building muscle. It was about developing the kind of grip strength, core stability, and total body power that would keep a gladiator alive when someone was trying to kill him with a sword. Modern powerlifters who think they're tough would probably take one look at a gladiator's stone lifting routine and immediately sign up for a nice, safe marathon instead. Lead weights were particularly popular in gladiator training because they were dense, expensive, and utterly unforgiving. A lead weight that looked manageable would suddenly feel like it weighed twice as much as expected, and dropping one on your foot was a good way to end your fighting career before it started. The lead weights were used for everything from basic lifting exercises to complex movements that developed coordination and balance. The running component of gladiator training was designed to build both endurance and speed, because arena combat required fighters who could maintain their energy throughout long battles while still being able to move quickly when necessary. But this wasn't recreational jogging around scenic Roman neighborhoods. This was intense, purposeful running that pushed gladiators to their physical limits and beyond. Gladiators ran in full gear, carrying weapons, wearing armor, and dealing with the kind of physical load that would make modern military training look comfortable. They ran in the heat of the Mediterranean sun, on rough terrain, and for distances that would challenge modern endurance athletes. The running wasn't just about cardiovascular fitness. It was about mental toughness, pain tolerance, and the ability to keep fighting when your body was screaming for you to stop. Bodyweight exercises were a huge part of gladiator conditioning, but these weren't the kind of push-ups and sit-ups you might do in a modern fitness class. Gladiators performed exercises that used their own body weight to build functional strength, explosive power, and the kind of physical resilience that could help them survive sword wounds and continue fighting. The bodyweight routines included exercises that modern athletes would recognize: push-ups, pull-ups, squats, and lunges, but performed with an intensity and duration that would hospitalize most people today. Gladiators did these exercises until failure, then kept doing them, then did them some more, because the alternative to perfect physical conditioning was death in the arena. Combat training with wooden weapons was perhaps the most ingenious aspect of gladiator conditioning. The wooden swords, shields, and spears that gladiators used for training were deliberately made twice as heavy as their real combat equipment. This meant that when they finally got to use actual weapons in the arena, everything felt light, fast, and easy to handle. Imagine training for months with a wooden sword that weighs as much as a baseball bat, then suddenly being handed a real sword that feels like a feather in comparison. The psychological and physical advantage was enormous. Gladiators entered the arena with equipment that felt effortless to use, because they'd been training with deliberately cumbersome gear. The heavy wooden weapons also built the kind of muscle memory and technique that couldn't be developed any other way. When you've spent months swinging a sword that's twice as heavy as normal, your form becomes perfect, your timing becomes precise, and your stamina becomes legendary. It was like training at high altitude, then competing at sea level. Everything became easier and more effective. Sparring practice was conducted without armor, which sounds insane until you understand the logic. Gladiators needed to develop lightning-fast reflexes, perfect defensive positioning, and the ability to read their opponent's movements instantly. Training without armor meant that every mistake resulted in pain, every lapse in concentration led to injury, and every moment of the sparring session demanded total focus and commitment. The unarmored sparring sessions were brutal, bloody, and incredibly effective at developing the skills that kept gladiators alive. Modern martial artists who train with protective gear would be horrified by the idea of full contact sparring without protection. But gladiators understood that the pain of training was preferable to the death that awaited fighters who weren't properly prepared. Sandbag training was another crucial component of gladiator conditioning, and these weren't the neat, convenient sandbags you might see in a modern gym. These were heavy, awkward, sand-filled leather bags that fighters used to develop punching power, grappling strength, and the ability to handle opponents who were trying to wrestle them to the ground. The sandbags were used for striking practice, throwing drills, and conditioning exercises that toughened the gladiators' bodies and prepared them for the physical trauma of combat. Hitting a sandbag with your fists, elbows, knees, and feet was a daily routine that developed both offensive capability and defensive durability. Post-training, which was basically ancient Rome's version of a heavy bag workout, involved gladiators practicing their techniques on wooden posts that were driven into the ground. These posts were targets for sword strikes, spear thrusts, and shield techniques, allowing fighters to perfect their accuracy and power without risking injury to training partners. The post-training was methodical and repetitive, with gladiators performing the same strikes and techniques hundreds of times per day until they became automatic. The wooden posts were scarred and battered from constant use, testament to the thousands of hours of practice that went into creating a competent arena fighter. The physical conditioning program for gladiators was designed to create fighters who could perform at peak levels under extreme stress, in terrible conditions, while dealing with the psychological pressure of mortal combat. The training was so intense that simply surviving it was an achievement. Many gladiators were injured or killed during training sessions that were meant to prepare them for arena combat. The conditioning program was also designed to weed out fighters who didn't have the physical or mental toughness to succeed in the arena. Gladiators who couldn't handle the training regimen were either reassigned to different roles, sold to less demanding owners, or simply allowed to die from the physical stress of the program. The irony of gladiator conditioning was that it was both life-saving and life-threatening. The intense physical preparation gave fighters the skills and stamina they needed to survive arena combat, but the training itself was dangerous enough to kill or permanently injure the very people it was supposed to help. But for gladiators who survived the conditioning program, the physical and mental benefits were enormous. They developed strength, speed, endurance, and fighting skills that made them formidable opponents and valuable entertainers. The training was brutal, but it was also effective. Gladiators who completed the conditioning program were among the most physically capable fighters in the ancient world. The daily physical conditioning routine was a reminder that gladiators were both athletes and slaves, both carefully trained professionals and expendable property. Every exercise, every drill, and every training session was designed to make them better fighters, but also to reinforce their position as valuable assets in a system that treated human lives as entertainment commodities. After hours of grueling physical conditioning that would make modern athletes question their life choices, gladiators moved on to the part of their training that separated the professionals from the corpses: combat technique and drills. This wasn't your neighborhood karate class, where everyone gets a participation trophy and goes home with their limbs intact. This was systematic, scientific training in the art of staying alive, while other people tried to kill you for the entertainment of cheering crowds. The combat training system for gladiators was so sophisticated, so specialized, and so utterly focused on practical lethality that it would make modern military training programs look like recreational activities. These weren't generic fighting techniques that worked for everyone. This was customized combat training based on specific gladiator styles, each with its own weapons, armor, strengths, and weaknesses. The gladiator styles weren't just random categories that someone made up for variety. They were carefully designed fighting systems that created dramatic matchups and entertaining combat scenarios. The Murmillo fought with a sword and large shield, relying on defense and powerful strikes. The Thraex used a curved sword and small shield, emphasizing speed and agility. The Retiarius fought with a net and trident, depending on mobility and range. Each style required completely different training, different techniques, and different mental approaches to combat. The style assignments weren't based on personal preference or what looked cool. Trainers evaluated each gladiator's physical characteristics, personality, and natural abilities to determine which fighting style would give them the best chance of survival. A tall, lean fighter might become a retiarius who could use reach advantage. A short, stocky fighter might become a mamilo who could absorb punishment and deliver devastating close-range attacks. The drilling system was militaristic in its precision and repetition. Gladiators practiced the same techniques hundreds of times per day, thousands of times per week, until every movement became automatic and every response became instinctive. This wasn't creative, expressive fighting. This was mechanical, systematic combat training, designed to create predictable, reliable fighting machines. Footwork drills were the foundation of gladiator combat training, because all the strength and weapon skills in the world wouldn't help you if you couldn't move properly in the arena. Gladiators spent hours practicing stepping patterns, balance exercises, and movement techniques that would keep them alive when someone was trying to stab them with a sword. The footwork wasn't just about moving forward and backward. It was about maintaining balance while wearing armor, changing direction quickly on sand and dirt surfaces, and positioning yourself for optimal attack and defense angles. Modern fencers and martial artists would recognize the importance of footwork, but gladiator movement training was complicated by the need to perform while wearing heavy armor and carrying weapons in front of crowds who wanted to see blood. Shield positioning was another crucial component of gladiator technique training. The shield wasn't just a piece of defensive equipment. It was a weapon, a tool for controlling distance, and a psychological element that could intimidate opponents. Gladiators learned to use their shields for blocking, striking, pushing, and creating openings for attacks. The shield drills were repetitive and demanding, with gladiators practicing defensive positions, shield strikes, and combination movements that integrated shield work with weapon techniques. A gladiator who couldn't use his shield effectively was essentially fighting with one arm tied behind his back, which was a good way to end up dead in front of a disappointed crowd. Rhythm training was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of gladiator combat instruction. Experienced trainers understood that arena combat wasn't just about strength and speed. It was about timing, pacing, and the ability to control the flow of a fight. Gladiators learned to establish rhythm, break their opponent's rhythm, and use timing to create advantages that could determine the outcome of a battle. The rhythm training involved practicing combinations of attacks and defenses in specific patterns, learning to vary the speed and intensity of techniques, and developing the ability to read and respond to their opponent's rhythmic patterns. It was like learning to dance, except the dance was deadly and the music was the sound of clashing weapons and screaming crowds. The style versus style training system was designed to create dramatic, entertaining matchups that would thrill arena audiences. A heavily armored Mamilo fighting a lightly equipped Retiarius created a classic power versus speed dynamic that crowds loved to watch. A Thraex, with his curved sword facing a Secutor with his straight blade, provided different tactical challenges and visual excitement. Each style matchup required different strategies, different techniques, and different mental approaches. A Retiarius fighting a Mamilo needed to use speed and distance to avoid the heavily armored opponent's powerful attacks. A Mamilo fighting a Retiarius needed to close distance quickly and use superior protection to survive long enough to land decisive strikes. The training for these style matchups was incredibly specific and detailed. Gladiators didn't just learn to fight in their own style. They learned to fight against every other style they might encounter in the arena. They studied the strengths and weaknesses of each opponent type, practiced specific techniques for different matchups, and developed tactical approaches for various combat scenarios. The weapons training was conducted with an attention to detail that would impress modern military instructors. Every grip, every stance, every strike, and every defensive movement was analyzed, perfected, and drilled until it became second nature. Gladiators learned not just how to use their weapons, but how to maintain them, how to adapt when they were damaged, and how to continue fighting when their primary weapons were lost or broken. The training weapons were designed to be more difficult to use than actual combat equipment, which created an enormous advantage when gladiators finally got to fight with real gear. Training with heavier, more awkward weapons meant that actual combat weapons felt light, fast, and easy to handle. It was like preparing for a marathon by training with weights on your legs, then running the actual race without them. The psychological training component was integrated into every drill and every technique session. Gladiators learned to fight while dealing with fear, pain, exhaustion, and the psychological pressure of performing in front of crowds who wanted to see them suffer. The training prepared them not just for the physical demands of combat, but for the mental challenges of fighting when their lives depended on their performance. The instructors who supervised combat training were usually retired gladiators who had survived enough arena battles to earn their freedom, or at least their teaching positions. These men had experienced everything their students would face, and they brought a level of practical knowledge and hard-earned wisdom that couldn't be learned from books or theories. The teaching methods were harsh but effective, combining physical punishment for mistakes with detailed instruction in proper technique. A student who failed to maintain proper form might be struck with a training weapon, forced to repeat exercises until exhaustion, or subjected to additional drilling sessions that reinforce the importance of precision and attention to detail. The combat training sessions were designed to simulate arena conditions as closely as possible. Gladiators practiced fighting on sand, fighting while exhausted, fighting with damaged equipment, and fighting while dealing with distractions and noise. The training environment was created to prepare them for every possible scenario they might encounter in actual combat. The progression system for combat training was methodical and unforgiving. Gladiators started with basic techniques and gradually advanced to more complex combinations and tactical situations. Students who couldn't master the fundamentals were either held back, reassigned to different roles, or eliminated from the program through methods that didn't involve graduation ceremonies. The daily combat training routine was a reminder that gladiators were being prepared for a job that involved killing other people or being killed by them. Every drill, every technique, and every training session was designed to increase their chances of survival in situations where survival was never guaranteed. The combination of physical conditioning and combat technique training created fighters who were both incredibly skilled and thoroughly prepared for the brutal realities of arena combat. The training was designed to produce gladiators who could entertain crowds, survive battles, and generate profits for their owners. But it was also training that recognized the humanity and potential of men who were treated as property. The combat technique and drill sessions were where gladiators learned not just how to fight, but how to think, how to adapt, and how to survive in a system that valued them only for their ability to provide violent entertainment. The training was both their preparation for potential death and their best hope for staying alive long enough to possibly earn their freedom. After spending their mornings getting beaten up, cut open, and generally traumatized in the name of combat training, gladiators received medical care that was so advanced, so sophisticated, and so effective that it would make modern emergency room doctors jealous. This is where gladiator life gets really weird. These men were slaves who were treated as disposable property, but they also received healthcare that was better than what most free Roman citizens could ever dream of accessing. The medical care system for gladiators was like having a team of world-class sports medicine specialists, trauma surgeons, and physical therapists all working together to keep valuable athletes in peak condition. Except, instead of treating pulled hamstrings and tennis elbow, these ancient doctors were dealing with sword wounds, broken bones, and the kind of injuries that would make modern medical professionals question their career choices. The gladiator medical staff were among the most skilled practitioners in the Roman world. And that's not just because they had plenty of practice. These doctors were dealing with injuries that required immediate, effective treatment, because a gladiator who couldn't fight was a gladiatus who couldn't generate revenue. The medical care wasn't provided out of compassion. It was provided because injured fighters were bad for business. The in-house medical teams at gladiator schools were equipped with surgical instruments that rivaled anything available to Roman military doctors. They had scalpels, forceps, surgical needles, and specialized tools for treating the specific types of injuries that gladiators sustained during training and combat. The medical facilities in major gladiator schools were essentially ancient trauma centers designed specifically for treating combat injuries. Wound treatment was a daily reality in gladiator schools, and the medical staff had developed techniques for dealing with cuts, stabs, and slashes that would impress modern emergency physicians. They understood the importance of cleaning wounds, preventing infection, and promoting proper healing in ways that were remarkably advanced for their time. The cleaning process for wounds involved techniques that modern medicine would recognize as fundamentally sound. Gladiator doctors used wine, vinegar, and other substances with antimicrobial properties to clean wounds and prevent infection. They understood that dirty wounds led to complications that could kill valuable fighters, so they developed systematic approaches to wound care that maximized healing and minimized complications. Cauterization was a standard treatment for serious wounds, and while it sounds barbaric by modern standards, it was actually an effective technique for stopping bleeding and preventing infection. Gladiator doctors used heated metal instruments to seal wounds, destroy damaged tissue, and create conditions that promoted healing. The process was incredibly painful, but it was often the difference between life and death for seriously injured fighters. The suturing techniques used by gladiator doctors were sophisticated and effective, using materials like silk thread, animal sinew, and other substances that could hold wounds closed while they healed. The doctors understood the importance of proper wound closure, and they had developed stitching techniques that minimized scarring and maximized the chances of full recovery. Herbal medicine played a crucial role in gladiator healthcare, with medical staff using plants, roots, and other natural substances to treat pain, reduce inflammation, and promote healing. The gladiator doctors had access to medicinal herbs from throughout the Roman Empire, and they had developed sophisticated understanding of which treatments worked best for different types of injuries. The herbal treatments weren't just random folk remedies. They were carefully researched and systematically applied treatments that had been proven effective through years of experience. Gladiator doctors used willow bark for pain relief, aloe for burns, and various other plants for different medical conditions. Modern pharmacology has validated many of these ancient treatments as genuinely effective. Fracture treatment in gladiator schools was remarkably advanced, with doctors who understood the importance of proper bone alignment, immobilization, and rehabilitation. They used splints, casts, and other devices to ensure that broken bones healed properly, and that fighters could return to combat as quickly as possible. The bone-setting techniques used by gladiator doctors were based on practical experience with the types of fractures that resulted from combat training and arena fighting. They understood how to reduce dislocations, align fractures, and create conditions that promoted proper healing. The success rate for fracture treatment in gladiator schools was probably higher than in most other medical settings of the time. Infection prevention was a major focus of gladiator medical care, because infected wounds could kill valuable fighters or put them out of commission for extended periods. The medical staff understood the importance of cleanliness, proper wound care, and early intervention when infections developed. The doctors had developed techniques for identifying and treating infections that were remarkably effective for their time. They understood the signs of infection, the importance of drainage, and the need for aggressive treatment when serious infections developed. Many gladiators survived injuries that would have killed other people simply because they had access to superior medical care. Pain management was another area where gladiator medical care was surprisingly advanced. The doctors understood that fighters needed to be able to function despite injuries, so they developed techniques for managing pain that allowed gladiators to continue training and fighting even when they were hurt. The pain management techniques included both pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical approaches. Gladiator doctors used opium, alcohol, and other substances to manage severe pain, but they also used massage, heat therapy, and other techniques that helped fighters cope with the constant physical discomfort of their profession. The psychological aspects of gladiator medical care were also sophisticated and important. The doctors understood that fighters needed to maintain confidence in their physical abilities, so they worked to ensure that treatments not only promoted healing, but also preserved the gladiator's mental state and fighting spirit. The medical staff served as counselors, motivators, and psychological support for gladiators who were dealing with the trauma of serious injuries. They understood that a fighter who lost confidence in his body was a fighter who was likely to die in the arena, so they made sure that medical treatment included attention to the psychological aspects of recovery. The rehabilitation programs for injured gladiators were systematic and comprehensive, designed to return fighters to peak condition as quickly and safely as possible. The medical staff understood the importance of gradual conditioning, proper exercise, and careful monitoring during the recovery process. The rehabilitation wasn't just about healing injuries. It was about ensuring that gladiators returned to fighting condition with full strength, mobility, and confidence. The medical staff worked with trainers to develop recovery programs that addressed both the physical and psychological aspects of returning to combat after serious injuries. The medical facilities in gladiator schools were equipped with specialized equipment for treating the types of injuries that fighters sustained. They had massage tables, exercise equipment, and therapeutic devices that were designed specifically for rehabilitating combat athletes. The quality of gladiator medical care created an ironic situation where enslaved fighters received better health care than most free Roman citizens. The medical attention available to gladiators was comparable to what was provided to Roman soldiers, and in many cases it was superior to the care available to wealthy civilians. The medical staff understood that their job was to keep valuable fighters healthy, active, and profitable. They were invested in the success of their patients not because they cared about them as people, but because they cared about them as assets. This created a system where gladiators received excellent medical care for entirely mercenary reasons. The survival rates for gladiators who received proper medical care were remarkably high, considering the violence of their profession. Many fighters survived injuries that would have been fatal in other circumstances, simply because they had access to skilled doctors who understood how to treat combat trauma. The gladiator medical system was a reminder that these fighters were valuable property who deserved the best possible care, but only because that care protected the investments of their owners. The medical attention was both a privilege and a reminder of their status as commodities in a system that valued them only for their ability to generate entertainment and profit. The daily medical routine in gladiator schools was a constant reminder that these men were living on the edge of serious injury or death, but it was also a reminder that they had access to resources and care that most people in the ancient world could never imagine receiving. In the rare moments when gladiators weren't being systematically brutalized in the name of training, they faced a different kind of challenge, finding ways to stay sane while living in what was essentially a combination prison, gym, and death preparation facility. Welcome to Gladiator Downtime, where boredom wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a psychological threat that could drive men to desperation, rebellion, or complete mental breakdown. The free time available to gladiators was deliberately limited, because idle hands and idle minds were dangerous things. When those hands knew how to use weapons, and those minds belonged to people who had very little left to lose. The trainers and guards understood that boredom could be more dangerous than rebellion, because bored gladiators started thinking about escape, started questioning their situation, and started remembering what life was like before they became property. Gambling was the most popular way for gladiators to pass their limited free time, and it wasn't just casual entertainment. It was a psychological necessity. Dice games, betting on training matches, and wagering on everything from weather to the outcome of political events gave gladiators a way to exercise some control over their circumstances and experience the thrill of risk-taking in a controlled environment. The gambling wasn't just about winning or losing money. Though gladiators did have small amounts of personal currency they could use for betting, it was about creating artificial excitement, building social connections, and experiencing the rush of victory in situations where they had very little opportunity for genuine achievement. A gladiator who won a dice game might feel like he had some luck, some skill, or some reason to be optimistic about his chances in the arena. Board games were another popular pastime, with gladiators playing ancient versions of chess, checkers, and other strategy games that helped keep their minds sharp while providing social interaction. These games served multiple purposes. They developed strategic thinking skills that could be useful in combat. They provided mental stimulation that helped prevent depression and despair. And they created opportunities for gladiators to bond with each other. The board games also served as a form of mental training, because arena combat required strategic thinking, the ability to anticipate opponents' moves, and the capacity to adapt quickly to changing situations. Playing games that required these skills helped gladiators maintain their mental agility and develop the kind of tactical thinking that could keep them alive in the arena. Crafts and personal projects were encouraged as ways to keep gladiators occupied and mentally engaged during their downtime. Many fighters carved wooden tokens, decorated their weapons, or created small personal items that gave them a sense of accomplishment and individual expression. These activities weren't just hobbies, they were forms of therapy that helped gladiators maintain their humanity in a system that treated them as objects. The weapon decoration was particularly popular because it allowed gladiators to personalize their equipment and create some connection to the tools that their lives depended on. A gladiator who had spent hours carving designs into his sword handle or shield might feel more confident and connected to his equipment when he used it in combat. Graffiti was another common form of expression, with gladiators scratching messages, names, and images into the walls of their living quarters. These weren't just random vandalism, they were attempts to leave some mark of their existence, to communicate with future occupants, and to express thoughts and feelings that they couldn't share openly. The graffiti served as a form of communication between gladiators from different time periods, with new fighters reading the messages left by previous occupants and adding their own contributions to the ongoing conversation. Some of the graffiti was practical, sharing information about trainers, tactics, or survival strategies. Other graffiti was emotional, expressing fear, hope, love, or despair. Token carving was a particularly meaningful activity because it allowed gladiators to create small, personal objects that they could keep with them and that represented their individual identity. These tokens might be carved with personal symbols, names of loved ones, or religious imagery that provided comfort and connection to life outside the ludus. The social aspects of gladiator downtime were crucial for maintaining mental health and building the relationships that could help fighters survive their circumstances. Gladiators formed friendships, shared stories, and created support networks that helped them cope with the psychological pressure of their situation. The conversations during downtime ranged from practical discussions about training and combat techniques to deeply personal sharing about families, fears, and dreams. These conversations helped gladiators maintain their connection to their humanity and provided emotional support that was essential for psychological survival. The storytelling tradition was particularly important, with gladiators sharing tales of their lives before the ludus, their combat experiences, and their hopes for the future. These stories helped maintain connections to the outside world and provided entertainment that didn't require equipment or supervision. The trainers and guards who supervised gladiator downtime understood that some leisure activity was necessary for maintaining morale and preventing despair, but they also knew that too much free time could lead to trouble. The balance between allowing enough downtime to prevent mental breakdown and maintaining enough control to prevent rebellion was a constant challenge. The limited nature of gladiator downtime made every moment of freedom precious and meaningful. Activities that free Romans might take for granted, a game of dice, a conversation with friends, the opportunity to carve a piece of wood, became significant events that provided psychological relief and human connection. The downtime activities also served as a form of mental preparation for arena combat, because they helped gladiators develop the psychological resilience, social connections, and mental flexibility that could help them survive the pressures of fighting for their lives in front of cheering crowds. For gladiators, downtime wasn't just a break from training. It was an opportunity to remember that they were human beings with thoughts, feelings, and individual identities that existed beyond their role as entertainment for Roman audiences. The strangest part of gladiator life wasn't the daily threat of death or the brutal training regimen. It was the bizarre celebrity culture that turned enslaved fighters into ancient Rome's equivalent of rock stars. Successful gladiators lived in a weird twilight zone where they were simultaneously property and celebrities, slaves and superstars, with fan clubs that would make modern influencers jealous and social media presence that came in the form of graffiti and figurines. The most successful gladiators achieved genuine celebrity status that transcended their slave origins. Names like Spartacus, Flamma, and Carpophorus were known throughout the Roman Empire, with fans who followed their careers, collected memorabilia, and traveled great distances to watch them fight. These gladiators had achieved something that most free Romans never experienced: genuine fame and public recognition. The fan culture surrounding popular gladiators was intense and sophisticated. Supporters would gather outside gladiator schools, hoping to catch glimpses of their heroes, much like modern fans camping outside hotels to see celebrities. They would cheer for specific fighters, place bets on their matches, and engage in heated debates about their favorites' fighting styles and chances of survival. Graffiti celebrating gladiators covered the walls of Roman cities, with messages like "Celadus makes the girls swoon" and "Cresces is the net fighter's delight." These ancient fan messages show that gladiator worship was serious business, with supporters who were emotionally invested in their heroes' success and survival. The merchandising around popular gladiators was extensive and profitable. Merchants sold oil lamps decorated with gladiator images, figurines depicting famous fighters, and even bottles of gladiator sweat that were marketed as cosmetics and aphrodisiacs. The sweat was supposedly collected from training sessions and sold to fans who believed it had magical properties. The oil flasks containing gladiator sweat were particularly popular among Roman women, who used them as perfume and believed they would make them more attractive. The idea that sweaty, dirty gladiators were considered sexually appealing says something interesting about Roman beauty standards and the power of celebrity culture to transform perception. Some gladiators developed relationships with wealthy Roman women who were attracted to their fame, physical prowess, and dangerous lifestyle. These relationships were technically illegal and definitely scandalous, but they happened anyway because the combination of celebrity status and forbidden romance was irresistible to some aristocratic women. The affairs between gladiators and upper-class women were dangerous for everyone involved. The women risked social disgrace and legal consequences for consorting with slaves. The gladiators risked punishment, torture, or death if they were caught. But the relationships continued because they offered both parties something they couldn't get elsewhere: genuine passion and human connection. Certain gladiator schools allowed controlled visits from women, recognizing that sexual relationships were necessary for maintaining morale and preventing despair. These visits were carefully supervised and limited, but they provided gladiators with some of the human intimacy that was otherwise missing from their lives. The privileges available to successful gladiators were significant but carefully controlled. Famous fighters might receive better food, private rooms, personal servants, and other luxuries that were denied to less successful gladiators. But these privileges came with the understanding that they were temporary and could be revoked at any time. The most successful gladiators sometimes earned enough money to purchase better equipment, hire personal trainers, or even buy slaves of their own. The irony of slaves owning slaves wasn't lost on anyone, but it was a testament to the earning potential of gladiators who could consistently entertain crowds and survive arena combat. Despite their fame and privileges, gladiators remained property. They couldn't leave the ludus without permission, couldn't refuse to fight, and couldn't control their own destinies. The celebrity status was real, but it was celebrity within a system that treated them as valuable objects rather than free human beings. The psychological impact of fame was complex for gladiators. On one hand, the recognition and admiration provided some compensation for the brutality of their circumstances. On the other hand, the fame was based on their ability to provide violent entertainment, which was a constant reminder of their dehumanized status. The fan culture surrounding gladiators created a strange dynamic where enslaved fighters were simultaneously worshipped and disposable. Fans would cheer wildly for their heroes, then watch with equal enthusiasm as those same heroes were killed in the arena. The celebrity culture was genuine, but it was also fundamentally based on the entertainment value of human suffering. For gladiators, fame was both a blessing and a curse. It provided privileges, recognition, and some measure of power within their constrained circumstances. But it also increased the pressure to perform, made them more valuable to their owners, and created expectations that could be deadly if they failed to meet them. The celebrity culture around gladiators was a reminder that even in systems designed to dehumanize people, individual achievement and charisma could create opportunities for recognition and limited freedom. But it was also a reminder that fame without legal freedom was ultimately hollow, and that celebrity status couldn't change the fundamental reality of slavery. Life in a gladiator school wasn't just about learning to fight. It was about learning to fight while being watched, evaluated, and controlled every moment of every day. The surveillance system in a ludus was so comprehensive, so constant, and so paranoid that it would make modern prison wardens look relaxed about security. Every movement, every conversation, and every facial expression was monitored by people whose job was to ensure that valuable gladiators stayed valuable, obedient, and alive. The trainers who supervised gladiator activities were usually retired fighters who had earned their freedom through years of successful combat. These men understood the gladiator mindset because they had lived it, which made them both effective teachers and dangerous supervisors. They knew every trick for avoiding work, every method of rebellion, and every sign that a gladiator might be planning something stupid. The retired gladiator trainers brought a level of credibility and respect that civilian supervisors could never achieve. When a trainer who had survived 20 arena battles told you to practice your footwork, you practiced your footwork. When a trainer who had killed men with his bare hands told you to stop slacking, you stopped slacking immediately. But the trainer-student relationship was complicated by the fact that these supervisors were also enforcers of a system that treated gladiators as property. The trainers might understand and even sympathize with their students' situations, but they were also responsible for maintaining discipline, preventing escapes, and ensuring that gladiators remained profitable investments. The punishment system for gladiators who violated rules or failed to meet expectations was swift, brutal, and designed to discourage future infractions. Beatings were common for minor offenses like laziness or disrespect. More serious violations might result in reduced food rations, solitary confinement, or assignment to fights that were essentially death sentences. The isolation punishment was particularly effective because it deprived gladiators of the social connections that helped them maintain their sanity. Being locked alone in a cell for days or weeks with minimal food and no human contact was a psychological torture that broke down even the strongest fighters. The surveillance extended beyond formal punishment to constant evaluation of gladiator behavior, attitude, and loyalty. Trainers were looking for signs of depression, rebellion, or potential escape attempts. A gladiator who seemed too quiet might be planning something. A gladiator who seemed too friendly with others might be organizing resistance. Escape attempts were incredibly rare, not because gladiators were content with their situation, but because the security measures made escape virtually impossible. The ludus was designed like a fortress, with high walls, armed guards, and controlled access points. Even if a gladiator managed to get outside the walls, he would be immediately recognizable as an escaped slave in a society that was constantly watching for runaways. The few gladiators who attempted escape faced punishments that were designed to be public examples for other fighters. Crucifixion, being fed to wild animals, or being forced to fight in rigged matches were common fates for escapees who were recaptured. The psychological pressure of constant surveillance created an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that made it difficult for gladiators to form genuine friendships or plan collective action. Everyone knew that someone might be watching, listening, or reporting on their activities. The surveillance system was ultimately about protecting investments rather than maintaining justice. Gladiator owners had too much money invested in their fighters to risk losing them to escape, rebellion, or self-destruction. The constant monitoring was a business necessity that happened to involve human lives. For gladiators, living under surveillance was a daily reminder that they were valuable property rather than free individuals. Every moment of privacy was precious, every unguarded conversation was risky, and every expression of dissatisfaction was potentially dangerous. The surveillance created a prison mentality where gladiators learned to hide their true thoughts, suppress their emotions, and present themselves as obedient, reliable fighters who posed no threat to the system that owned them. When the Mediterranean sun reached its peak and most sensible Romans were taking their afternoon naps, gladiators were just getting started with the deadliest part of their training day. The afternoon sessions were when gladiators practiced with real weapons, the actual swords, spears, and shields that they would use to kill or be killed in the arena. This wasn't practice anymore. This was rehearsal for death. The midday heat was brutal, turning the training grounds into furnaces that would make modern athletes immediately call for water breaks and shade tents. But gladiators trained through the heat because arena combat didn't stop for weather, and crowds actually enjoyed watching fighters struggle with exhaustion and dehydration along with their opponents. Training in the heat served multiple purposes beyond simple torture. It built heat tolerance that would be crucial during long arena battles. It simulated the conditions gladiators would face during actual combat. and it weeded out fighters who couldn't handle the physical stress of performing under extreme conditions. The weapons practice with real equipment was strictly controlled and heavily supervised. Actual swords, spears, and shields were only brought out under direct trainer supervision, with multiple guards present and escape routes carefully blocked. The trainers understood that putting real weapons in the hands of enslaved fighters was inherently dangerous, but it was also absolutely necessary for proper combat preparation. The transition from heavy wooden training weapons to actual combat gear was dramatic and psychologically significant. After months of training with equipment that was deliberately cumbersome and difficult to use, real weapons felt impossibly light and fast. The psychological boost was enormous. Gladiators felt like they had superhuman speed and strength when they finally got to use proper equipment. Real weapons practice focused on specific techniques and combinations that gladiators would need to survive arena combat. These weren't creative, expressive fighting sessions. They were systematic drills designed to perfect the mechanical movements that could save lives. Every strike, every block, and every footwork pattern was practiced until it became automatic. The choreographed combinations were particularly important because arena combat often involved pre-planned sequences and dramatic moments that would entertain crowds. Gladiators needed to be able to execute these planned sequences while still maintaining the ability to react to unexpected situations and genuine threats. The controlled aggression training was perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of weapons practice. Gladiators had to learn to be violent and ruthless while still maintaining enough self-control to follow orders, protect valuable opponents, and create entertaining spectacles rather than simply efficient killings. The afternoon weapons sessions were also when gladiators practiced the specific techniques they would need for their assigned fighting styles. Aretiarius learned to use his net and trident in combination, developing the timing and coordination needed to trap and kill opponents. A Mamillo practiced the shield and sword techniques that would allow him to survive against faster, more agile opponents. The supervision during weapons practice was intense and paranoid. Trainers watched every movement, every expression, and every interaction between gladiators. They were looking for signs of rebellion, violence against fellow fighters, or attempts to use weapons for anything other than approved training purposes. The weapons themselves were carefully controlled and accounted for. Every sword, spear, and shield was checked out like library books, with strict procedures for handling, use, and return. Missing weapons meant immediate searches, interrogations, and punishments that served as examples for other gladiators. The afternoon training sessions were also when gladiators practiced fighting through pain and injury. They learned to continue fighting with cuts, bruises, and minor injuries that would normally stop combat. This training was essential because arena battles often continued even when fighters were seriously hurt. The mental preparation during weapons practice was as important as the physical training. Gladiators had to develop the psychological ability to hurt and kill other human beings, while also maintaining enough humanity to function as social beings during the rest of their lives. The afternoon weapons sessions created a strange psychological dynamic, where gladiators were simultaneously preparing to kill each other and depending on each other for survival. The man practicing next to you might be your opponent in the arena, but he was also your training partner, your friend, and your fellow victim, in a system that treated you both as disposable entertainment. For gladiators, the afternoon weapons practice was both the most exciting and most terrifying part of their training day. It was when they felt most like real fighters and most like condemned prisoners. The real weapons in their hands represented both their power and their powerlessness. They were deadly, but only when and how their owners permitted. Behind all the celebrity status, advanced medical care, and professional training was a psychological reality that would break most modern people within weeks. Gladiators were living with the constant knowledge that they were probably going to die violently for the entertainment of strangers. The emotional toll of this existence was so severe that it would make modern trauma counselors weep just thinking about it. The fundamental psychological challenge of gladiator life was learning to function normally while knowing that your death was not just possible, but likely, and that when it happened, thousands of people would cheer. Imagine trying to maintain your sanity while living in a system where your survival depends on your ability to kill people who are in exactly the same terrible situation as you. Most gladiators were enslaved against their will, which meant they were dealing with the trauma of losing their freedom, their families, and their former identities. They had to process the grief of their old lives, while simultaneously preparing for a future that probably involved dying, in front of crowds who saw them as disposable entertainment. The survivors' guilt was overwhelming for gladiators who lived through multiple arena battles. Every victory meant that someone else had died, often someone they had trained with, eaten with, and considered a friend. The psychological weight of repeatedly killing colleagues and watching friends die was something that no amount of fame or privileges could offset. Many gladiators developed coping mechanisms that would be familiar to modern psychologists. Some became deeply religious, clinging to beliefs about afterlife and divine protection that helped them make sense of their circumstances. Others became fatalistic, accepting their likely death and finding peace in the idea that their suffering would eventually end. The religious practices among gladiators were intense and personal. Some converted to mystery religions that promised salvation and eternal life. Others maintained devotion to traditional Roman gods, making offerings and prayers for protection. Many developed highly personal spiritual practices that combined elements from different belief systems. Poetry and writing became emotional outlets for gladiators who were literate enough to express their thoughts and feelings. Some of the most moving poetry from the ancient world came from gladiators who used written words to process their trauma, express their love for lost families, and document their experiences for future generations. The graffiti that gladiators scratched into walls wasn't just casual vandalism. It was desperate communication from people who needed to leave some record of their existence. Messages like, "Marcus was here," or "Remember Gaius," were attempts to ensure that their lives and deaths would be remembered by someone, even if that someone was just another doomed gladiator. Prayer became a constant part of gladiator life, with fighters developing elaborate rituals and superstitions that gave them some sense of control over their fate. Some prayed before every training session, others before every meal, and many spent sleepless nights praying for survival, freedom, or at least a quick death. The emotional isolation was particularly difficult because gladiators couldn't share their deepest fears and despair with the outside world. Free Romans saw them as entertainers and celebrities, not as human beings suffering from severe psychological trauma. The only people who truly understood their situation were other gladiators who were dealing with their own overwhelming emotional challenges. Depression was common among gladiators, though it wasn't recognized or treated as a medical condition. Fighters who lost their will to live became dangerous to themselves and others, sometimes deliberately seeking death in training or throwing themselves on opponents' weapons during combat. The fear was constant but had to be carefully managed. Gladiators who appeared too frightened might be seen as poor investments and assigned to fights that were essentially executions. But gladiators who showed no fear at all might be considered dangerous rebels and subjected to increased surveillance and punishment. The bonds between gladiators were intensely emotional, but also tragically temporary. Friendships formed quickly and deeply because of shared trauma, but they were always shadowed by the knowledge that friends might have to kill each other in the arena. Some gladiators deliberately avoided close relationships to protect themselves from the pain of loss. The psychological preparation for arena combat involved learning to disconnect emotionally from the violence they were about to experience. Gladiators had to develop the mental ability to hurt and kill other human beings, while still maintaining enough humanity to function as social beings. Many gladiators wrote wills or final letters before important fights, not just to distribute their few possessions, but to express feelings and thoughts they couldn't share while alive. These documents were often their only opportunity to speak honestly about their experiences and emotions. The emotional toll of gladiator life was compounded by the knowledge that their suffering was entertainment for others. Unlike soldiers who died for causes they believed in, gladiators died for the amusement of crowds who saw their pain as recreational. This psychological reality was perhaps the most difficult aspect of their existence to process and accept. For gladiators, every day was a psychological battle between hope and despair, between the will to survive and the temptation to give up. The emotional toll of their existence was a constant reminder that they were human beings trapped in a system that treated them as objects, fighting to maintain their sanity while preparing for their likely death. When the sun finally set and the brutal training day mercifully ended, gladiators faced the strange psychological challenge of trying to act like normal human beings while eating dinner in what was essentially a death preparation facility. The evening meal was the closest thing to normal social interaction that gladiators experienced, which tells you everything you need to know about how abnormal their lives had become. The communal dining experience was both a blessing and a curse for gladiators. On one hand, it provided social connection, shared conversation, and a brief respite from the isolation and fear that dominated their existence. On the other hand, it was a daily reminder that they were sharing meals with people they might have to kill or who might kill them in the very near future. The evening meals were substantial and filling, designed to help gladiators recover from the day's brutal training and prepare for the next day's punishment. But the food was also basic and repetitive, more of the same barley porridge, beans, and vegetables that had sustained them through breakfast and lunch. Imagine trying to enjoy dinner when you know it might be one of your last, and the menu is the same boring gruel you've eaten every day for months. The communal dining halls were designed to facilitate social interaction while maintaining control and surveillance. Long tables accommodated dozens of gladiators, creating opportunities for conversation and relationship building, while also making it easy for guards and trainers to monitor discussions and prevent conspiracy. The conversations during evening meals were a fascinating mix of mundane daily concerns and life or death anxieties. Gladiators might discuss training techniques, complain about injuries, share news from the outside world, or speculate about upcoming fights. But underneath every conversation was the shared understanding that they were all living on borrowed time. The gossip network in gladiator schools was sophisticated and crucial for survival. Information about upcoming matches, changes in training routines, or shifts in the political climate could affect a gladiator's chances of survival. Evening meals were when this information was shared, analyzed, and used to make strategic decisions about training, alliances, and preparation. Rumors about fight pairings created intense anxiety and speculation during evening meals. Gladiators would analyze every hint, every comment from trainers, and every change in routine for clues about who would be fighting whom in upcoming arena events. The announcement of actual pairings could send shockwaves through the dining hall that affected everyone's appetite and mood. The social dynamics during evening meals were complex and constantly shifting. Gladiators formed alliances, rivalries, and friendships that could change dramatically based on training performance, rumors about upcoming fights, or simple personality conflicts. The dining hall was where these relationships were negotiated, maintained, and sometimes destroyed. Some gladiators used evening meals as opportunities for informal mentoring, with experienced fighters sharing survival tips, combat techniques, and psychological coping strategies with newer gladiators. These conversations were often the difference between life and death for inexperienced fighters who were still learning the brutal realities of their profession. The psychological pressure of evening meals was intense because they forced gladiators to confront the social and emotional aspects of their situation. During training, they could focus on physical techniques and immediate survival. During meals, they had to deal with the human connections and emotional bonds that made their circumstances even more tragic. The evening meals also served as informal therapy sessions, where gladiators could share their fears, hopes, and survival strategies with people who understood their situation. These conversations provided emotional support that was essential for maintaining mental health in an environment designed to break down individual identity and replace it with fighting machine efficiency. The anticipation of fight announcements created a special kind of tension during evening meals. Gladiators knew that their trainer or school administrator might appear at any moment to announce pairings for upcoming arena events. These announcements could transform a relatively relaxed dinner into a scene of terror, despair, and frantic preparation. The reaction to fight announcements varied dramatically depending on the gladiators involved. Some fighters accepted their fate with stoic resignation. Others became emotional, angry, or desperate. The dining hall would buzz with analysis of the matchups, speculation about the outcomes, and advice for the fighters who had been selected. Evening meals were also when gladiators dealt with the emotional aftermath of training injuries, conflicts with other fighters, or news from the outside world. The communal dining experience provided a setting for processing these experiences and seeking support from fellow gladiators who understood the unique pressures of their existence. The conversations during evening meals often revealed the incredible diversity of backgrounds among gladiators. Former soldiers, captured slaves, criminals, and volunteers shared their stories, creating a rich tapestry of human experience that was both fascinating and heartbreaking. For many gladiators, the evening meal was the only time of day when they could temporarily forget their circumstances and enjoy simple human pleasures like food, conversation, and companionship. But even these moments of normalcy were shadowed by the knowledge that everything could change with a single announcement or a trainer's decision. The evening meals in gladiator schools were ultimately a reminder that even in the most dehumanizing circumstances, people find ways to maintain their humanity through social connection, shared experience, and mutual support. But they were also a daily reminder that this humanity existed within a system that treated them as disposable entertainment rather than human beings deserving of dignity and freedom. The night before an arena fight was when gladiators discovered exactly how much terror the human mind could experience while still technically functioning. This wasn't the kind of pre-game jitters that modern athletes feel before big competitions. This was the psychological experience of knowing that tomorrow, in front of thousands of cheering spectators, you would either kill someone or be killed yourself, and both outcomes were equally horrifying. Sleep became virtually impossible for gladiators who had been selected for upcoming arena battles. The combination of fear, adrenaline, and desperate mental preparation created a state of hyperarousal that made rest nearly impossible. Gladiators would lie awake on their stone floors, staring at the ceiling, and trying to process the reality that they might be dead within 24 hours. The pre-fight insomnia wasn't just about fear of death. It was about fear of failure, fear of pain, fear of disappointing crowds, and fear of dying in a way that would be remembered as cowardly or pathetic. Gladiators understood that their deaths would be public spectacles, and many were more terrified of dying badly than of dying at all. Some gladiators dealt with pre-fight anxiety through religious rituals and desperate prayers to whatever gods they believed might protect them. They would pray to Mars for strength, to fortune for luck, to their household gods for protection, and sometimes to foreign deities they had learned about from other fighters. The prayers were often frantic, repetitive, and accompanied by small offerings of food, personal items, or promises of devotion. The religious preparation was both comforting and terrifying because it forced gladiators to confront the possibility that even divine intervention might not be enough to save them. They prayed for survival, but they also prayed for courage, for a quick death if survival wasn't possible, and for their souls to find peace in whatever afterlife awaited them. Fasting was another common pre-fight ritual, though it was often involuntary because anxiety made eating nearly impossible. Some gladiators deliberately avoided food because they believed it would make them faster and more agile. Others couldn't keep food down because their stomachs were twisted with fear and stress. The obsessive weapon maintenance that occupied many gladiators during their final night was both practical and psychological. They would sharpen their swords until the edges were perfect, oil their armor until it gleamed, and check every strap and buckle multiple times. The repetitive activity provided some distraction from their fear, while also ensuring that their equipment would perform flawlessly when their lives depended on it. The weapon preparation became ritualistic and almost meditative for some gladiators. They would spend hours working on equipment that was already in perfect condition, using the familiar activities as a way to calm their minds and maintain some sense of control over their circumstances. Writing wills and final letters was a common pre-fight activity that served both practical and emotional purposes. Gladiators would distribute their few possessions, write messages to loved ones they might never see again, and sometimes compose their own epitaphs. These documents were often their only opportunity to express their true feelings about their situation and their hopes for what might happen after their death. The will-writing process was emotionally devastating because it forced gladiators to confront the reality of their situation and say goodbye to the people and things they cared about most. But it was also therapeutic because it provided a way to process their emotions and feel like they had some control over their legacy. Personal item distribution was another pre-fight ritual that created intense emotional moments between gladiators. Fighters would give away small possessions, carved tokens, lucky charms, or personal mementos to friends who might survive longer. These exchanges were often accompanied by final conversations, shared memories, and promises to remember the dead. The rumor mill reached peak intensity during pre-fight nights, with gladiators desperately seeking any information that might give them an advantage or help them prepare for what they were about to face. They would analyze their opponents' fighting styles, discuss potential strategies, and share intelligence about the political climate that might affect how their fights were judged. The speculation about crowd preferences, betting odds, and political influences created additional layers of anxiety for gladiators who were already dealing with the fundamental terror of mortal combat. They had to worry not just about defeating their opponents, but about entertaining the crowd and satisfying the complex social and political pressures that influenced arena events. Some gladiators spent their final nights trying to reconcile with opponents they were scheduled to fight, having emotional conversations with men they might kill or be killed by within hours. These interactions were profoundly disturbing because they forced gladiators to confront the humanity of their opponents while preparing to destroy them. The psychological preparation for combat involved trying to develop the mental state necessary to hurt and kill other human beings, while maintaining enough emotional control to function effectively. This mental preparation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of pre-fight preparation, because it required gladiators to temporarily suppress their natural human empathy and moral instincts. The pre-fight night was ultimately a concentrated experience of all the psychological horrors that gladiators lived with every day. The fear, isolation, desperation, and forced acceptance of their circumstances became overwhelming during these final hours before arena combat. For gladiators, the night before a fight was when they faced the full reality of their situation and tried to find the courage to face whatever tomorrow might bring. When the crowds roared their approval and the sand of the arena turned red with blood, they were cheering for men they would never meet and never mourn. The gladiators who died for Roman entertainment were infinitely more complex, more human, and more tragic than the simple killers that movies and popular culture have made them out to be. The real lives of gladiators were a fascinating contradiction of advanced training, sophisticated medical care, and celebrity status existing within a system of absolute brutality and dehumanization. These men received better health care than most free Romans, ate carefully planned diets designed by experts, and followed training regimens that would impress modern sports scientists. Yet they were still property, still trapped, and still likely to die violently, for the amusement of people who saw them as disposable entertainment. The gladiator system revealed both the best and worst of Roman civilization. It showed a society capable of remarkable sophistication in training, medicine, and athletic performance. But it also revealed a culture that could treat human beings as investments, entertainment, and objects to be bought, sold, and discarded when they were no longer profitable or amusing. The daily routine of gladiators was a grinding combination of physical punishment, psychological pressure, and the constant awareness that everything they did was designed to prepare them for their likely death. They woke up in cells, ate calculated meals, trained with scientific precision, and went to sleep knowing that their survival depended on their ability to kill other people who were in exactly the same terrible situation. But within this system of dehumanization, gladiators found ways to maintain their humanity. They formed friendships, created art, practiced religion, and supported each other through circumstances that would break most people. They wrote poetry, carved tokens, and left messages for future generations that revealed their thoughts, fears, and hopes. The celebrity culture that surrounded successful gladiators was both a privilege and a burden. Fame brought better treatment, more privileges, and the admiration of thousands of fans. But it also brought increased pressure to perform, higher expectations for survival, and the constant reminder that their popularity was based on their ability to provide violent entertainment. The medical care that gladiators received was genuinely advanced and effective, but it existed only to protect valuable investments. The doctors who treated gladiator injuries were skilled and dedicated, but they were ultimately serving the financial interests of owners who saw their patients as property rather than people. The training system that produced gladiators was remarkably sophisticated and scientifically sound, but it was designed to create efficient killers rather than complete human beings. The physical conditioning, combat techniques, and psychological preparation were all focused on arena performance rather than personal development or individual fulfillment. The emotional toll of gladiator life was overwhelming and constant. These men lived with trauma that would require years of therapy by modern standards, but they had to process their psychological wounds while continuing to train, fight, and perform for crowds that saw their pain as entertainment. The gladiator system was ultimately a reminder that human beings can adapt to almost any circumstances, but that adaptation comes at a terrible cost. The gladiators who survived and thrived within this system were remarkable individuals who demonstrated incredible resilience, courage, and humanity under impossible conditions. Some gladiators did achieve freedom through exceptional performance, popular support, or the mercy of their owners. But freedom was rare, and most gladiators died in the arena, in training, or from the cumulative effects of their brutal lifestyle. The few who gained liberty often struggled to adjust to life outside the system that had defined their existence. The legacy of gladiators is complex and troubling. They were victims of a system that treated them as objects, but they were also skilled athletes, courageous fighters, and complex human beings who deserved better than their circumstances provided. Their lives remind us that entertainment built on human suffering is fundamentally wrong, regardless of how sophisticated or popular it becomes. The gladiator schools of ancient Rome were places where human potential was simultaneously developed and destroyed. They produced fighters of incredible skill and courage, but they did so by treating human beings as investments rather than individuals. The system worked efficiently for its intended purpose, but its success was built on the systematic dehumanization of the people it was designed to exploit. When the crowd roared, they cheered a man they'd never meet and never mourn. The gladiators who died for Roman entertainment were more than the sum of their violent performances. They were human beings who deserved to be remembered not just as killers or victims, but as complex individuals who maintained their humanity despite a system designed to destroy it. The real lives of gladiators were grueling, human, and far more complex than movies ever show. They remind us that behind every system of entertainment, every display of skill, and every moment of public spectacle, there are human beings whose lives, dreams, and suffering deserve to be acknowledged and remembered.